25 forgotten Depression-era survival tricks that kept families alive in the wilderness. Not the kind your great-grandmother tried once and abandoned the moment times got better. These are the tricks she had to master because her family's survival depended on it. And here is what most survival channels will never tell you. The Depression did not teach people how to survive in nature. It taught them how to survive by understanding nature in ways we have completely lost. Stay with me, because near the end of this video, I will show you the one trick that changes how you understand wilderness living altogether. It rewrites everything about self-reliance. If you are serious about wilderness survival, subscribe. And drop a comment below sharing one skill you wish you had learned from an older family member before they were gone. Let us see what we are losing. The trick here is not what these families did. It is why they succeeded where modern survival experts often fail. A modern survivalist goes into the wilderness with knowledge. A Depression family went in with something deeper. They went in with pattern recognition built into their bones through seasons of watching. They knew which trees held water because they had filled buckets from them for 3 generations. They knew which animals moved at what time because they had tracked them, not for fun, but for food. Wait, this part is important. You clicked on this video expecting a list of hacks. But what you are actually going to learn is something bigger. Our survival guide, a complete ebook on the forgotten principles behind Depression-era wilderness living, breaks down the mechanisms that made these techniques work. Not just the what, but the why, the principles, the patterns. That guide is available in the description and pinned in the comment section. It goes much deeper than 10 minutes can possibly take you. And yes, it is a paid resource, because the knowledge in it is worth your time and your money. Number 1 on this list surprises most people. Reading the landscape like a book. Depression families did not wander the wilderness looking for water or shelter. They read the ground itself, moss growth direction, the scent of certain plants after rain, the way animals had worn paths through dense brush. A child raised in the Ozarks could navigate by observing which side of the trees held the most lichen. Not because someone taught her consciously, because she had looked at 1,000 trees while working alongside her parents. Modern survival training teaches you to look for these signs. Depression families did not learn signs. They learned to see. There is a difference. When you are taught a sign, you search for it. When you learn to see, you simply notice. A woman walking through a forest who had foraged since childhood did not stop and think, "Ah, I recognize this marker." She felt the landscape. Her feet knew the angle of the slope. Her eyes caught the color difference in leaf litter that meant water was near. This is why many of those families survived what killed others. They were not following a checklist. They were responding to the living world around them with an literacy that came from being in it constantly. A Depression-era child did not learn wilderness survival the way you learn a skill from a video. They learned it the way you learn a language when you grow up speaking it. They could not separate their knowledge from their perception. Number 2, understanding the seasonal calendar differently. We think of seasons as dates. Winter arrives on December 21st. That is how modern life works. Depression families did not mark the calendar that way. They marked it by watching animals. When the certain birds returned, it meant time to plant. When specific insects emerged, it meant frost was ending. When the color of the evening sky changed in a certain way, it meant rain was coming. This was not intuition. It was observation so refined that it seemed like intuition. A woman who had watched the sky every evening for 30 years could predict rain with accuracy that baffled her neighbors. She was not reading the clouds the way you might read a cloud chart in a textbook. She was reading the entire atmosphere, the light quality, the way the wind moved, the smell, all at once. Number 3, break something most people believe about survival. Depression families did not rely on tools. They relied on understanding their environment well enough that they needed fewer tools. A family that knew every plant in a 10-mile radius did not need a field guide. They did not need a knife to process bark properly because their hands knew how to do it from decades of repetition. They did not need a compass because they could orient themselves by elements in the landscape that never changed. This seems impossible to modern ears. We are tool-dependent. We have been for generations. But a person raised in a world where knowledge could not be looked up, where YouTube did not exist, where you learned by watching and doing, developed a kind of literacy in the physical world that we have largely abandoned. That person could do more with less because more was not an option. Necessity did not create invention. It created perception. The real survival trick Depression families mastered was this. They treated the wilderness not as a puzzle to solve with tools and techniques, but as a living system they needed to understand. Every tree they approached as something to know, not as a resource to extract. Every animal they tracked not just to hunt it, but to understand where it lived and why. Every plant they used in ways that would allow it to regenerate. This is the foundation beneath every specific technique you are going to hear. The families that survived the depression in wilderness conditions survived because they had built relationships with their environments. That sounds sentimental. It is not. It is intensely practical. A landscape that gives you food, water, and shelter year after year is a landscape you have learned to read so well that you move through it without panic. You move through it with purpose. Number 12 was something depression families called reading the land. It meant walking a stretch of wilderness multiple times before you needed anything from it. Spring water always flows in the same direction. Game trails follow the same routes season after season. Berry patches return to the same clearings year after year. The families that lasted did not show up to the forest, desperate and unprepared. They showed up because they had already been there 100 times when they were not hungry. They knew which oak trees produced the heaviest acorns. They knew which creek ran clean in August but turned brackish in July. They knew how long it took pine sap to harden for waterproofing. This was not memory work. This was survival architecture. Number 11 dealt with something harder to explain. Depression families preserved not just food, but knowledge, through what historians now call location memory. They tied survival information directly to places. A certain rock formation meant fresh water lived below it. A particular slope angle meant wind would shelter you from certain storms. A meadow shaped like an hourglass always flooded first in heavy rain. By anchoring what they knew to specific physical landmarks, they could recall information instantly when danger came. Your mind holds locations far better than lists. A place sticks with you in ways that words on paper simply do not. Number 10 involved something called layered shelter design. This was critical in regions where weather changed in hours. A Depression-era wilderness family would construct shelter not as a single structure, but as nested fallbacks. The main dwelling sat in the safest location. But 50 yards away stood a secondary structure, smaller, built to withstand more extreme conditions. Further out sat lean-tos facing different directions. If the main shelter failed or became compromised, the family did not face unprotected exposure. They moved inward or outward depending on what the weather demanded. Modern survivalists call this redundancy. Depression families called it not dying. Before we continue, I need you to understand something fundamental here. The survival guide that covers all of this in depth, the patterns, the decision-making framework that tied these techniques together into something coherent, that resource sits in the description below and pinned in the comments. If you want to understand not just what these families did, but why their approach worked when so much of modern survival advice fails, that guide walks you through the entire philosophy. It is a paid resource, and honestly, it is the difference between memorizing tricks and actually knowing how to think like someone who survived real wilderness pressure. Number 9 was about water without wells. Wells took time to dig. Wells required tools that broke. Wells froze in winter. Depression families instead relied on something called seasonal capture. They understood that water moved through the landscape differently in each season. Summer meant collecting from fast-running creeks before the dry months hit. Fall meant filling every container while water was still abundant. Winter meant knowing exactly where springs stayed unfrozen because underground warmth kept them flowing. Spring meant understanding where snowmelt would gather and become trapped. They built small cisterns and stone-lined basins at these seasonal convergence points. These were not random placements. Each one existed where generations of observation had shown water would reliably accumulate. Number 8 concerned something darker. It was called knowing the boundary. Depression families that lived in wilderness or semi-wilderness areas understood that certain plants, certain animals, and certain weather patterns marked invisible lines. Cross one of these lines at the wrong time of year, and the landscape that had been feeding you could kill you in days. Some families knew that a particular ridge marked the edge of their safe territory. Moving beyond it meant entering terrain where they had no knowledge, no shelter sites, no reliable water sources. Others understood that certain berries only grew safely in one microclimate, and leaving that climate meant losing access to crucial nutrition. This was not superstition or imagination. This was mapping survival onto actual geography. Number 7 brought families back to something immediate and repeatable. It was called preserving through smoke. Before mechanical refrigeration, smoke was the only reliable way to store meat for months. But it was not just about hanging meat over a fire. Depression families understood the chemistry. Oak and hickory smoke created compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. Applying smoke too hot or too fast dried meat into something inedible, too cool and too slow, and meat spoiled before preservation took hold. The temperature, the wood type, the duration, the moisture content of the meat itself, all of it had to align. Families that got this right could preserve a deer or a wild boar in ways that meant eating protein through winter. Families that guessed, or that had not been taught by someone who knew, starved. Number 6 was quieter but equally critical. It was called rendering and storage. When a family killed an animal, nothing went unused. The fat was rendered slowly over low heat until it separated from the tissue, then strained through cheesecloth and poured into containers. That rendered fat became lard, the single most versatile ingredient in a depression kitchen. It was cooking medium, shortening for baking, preservative, even medicine for chapped skin. A 10-pound pig could yield 3 or 4 pounds of usable lard. Stored in a cool place, it lasted through spring. A family with rendered lard did not starve. A family without it ate less efficiently and hungrier. Modern kitchens abandoned lard when industrial vegetable shortening arrived, cleaner and whiter and promising health benefits that never materialized. We gained convenience and lost caloric density, lost the nutritional profile that kept families alive, lost the understanding that animal fat was not poison but survival. Number 5 required a different kind of knowledge. It was called wild plant identification and harvest. Families living in or near forests could feed themselves on plants that town dwellers did not even recognize. Ramps grew in spring. Wild greens were available through fall. Nuts ripened in autumn. Berries came and went with the season. But here is what matters. Families that did this right ate balanced diets. Families that guessed, that misidentified plants, that trusted luck instead of training, died. A grandmother teaching her children to identify wild leeks by smell and leaf shape was not doing something romantic or quaint. She was transferring survival information. Missing that training meant your children might not survive the next scarce season. The Depression forced families to remember this knowledge, to reactivate it, to teach it again to younger generations. Modern foraging trends celebrate this as wellness and adventure. For Depression families, it was the difference between dinner and hunger. Number 4 involved something even more elemental. It was called water sourcing and purification without chemicals. A family could live weeks without food, but only days without water. Wells sometimes ran dry. Rivers changed course or became contaminated. Depression families knew how to find water in places others would overlook. They boiled it over fire. They filtered it through sand and charcoal. Some families buried pots of water in certain spots, timing infiltration to let soil act as a filter. They tested water sources by observation, how plants grew around them, whether animals drank from them, what the smell and color suggested. This was not folklore. This was applied hydrology, done by people with no formal training, but absolute necessity driving their attention. Get this wrong and your family faced typhoid or cholera. Get it right, and you survived another season. Before we continue, I need to remind you of something. The survival patterns we are working through here, the logic that connected these tricks together, the underlying mechanisms that made them work. All of that is explained with full depth and visual reference in our complete guide available in the description and pinned in the top comment. It is a paid resource, but it covers the specific sequences and decision trees that separated successful families from those who failed. If you want to understand not just what these tricks were, but why they worked and how to implement them yourself, that is where you go. Number 3 was about shelter and insulation. Many Depression families lived in inadequate housing. Walls had gaps, roofs leaked. Insulation, as we know it, did not exist. Families stuffed walls with newspaper, straw, sawdust, anything that trapped air. They sealed cracks with clay mixed with animal hair. They hung burlap over windows and layered it with cloth to create dead airspace. They understood that clothing functioned as portable insulation. Wearing multiple thin layers trapped more warmth than one heavy garment. They slept on straw ticks instead of mattresses, but they also understood that sleeping position, the number of blankets, and body heat from multiple people in one bed all factored into survival through winter. A family that mastered shelter insulation without modern materials could reduce their fuel consumption by 40%. A family that did not shivered through winters and burned resources faster than they could gather them. Number 2 was about food preservation without ice or electricity. Every Depression family understood fermentation. Cabbage became sauerkraut in ceramic crocks, packed with salt and its own liquid, kept cool in root cellars. Cucumbers fermented into pickles. Beans were salted down in layers in barrels. Fruits were preserved in jars using the water bath canning method, which required nothing but a large pot of boiling water, glass jars, lids, and time. The acid in the fruit created a seal. The heat killed bacteria. A family could preserve an entire harvest in a weekend using equipment that cost almost nothing. Modern families buy canned goods for $3 a jar. Depression families made them for cents, or free if they foraged for fruit. The fermentation process also created probiotics, beneficial bacteria that improve digestion and immune function. Families did not know the science, but they knew the results. People who ate fermented foods stayed healthier through winter. Some families also understood drying. Apples were sliced thin and hung on strings in the kitchen, or suspended over the fire. Herbs were bundled and hung from rafters. Fish and venison were smoked and dried into jerky that lasted months without spoiling. Mushrooms were threaded on string and dried. Berries were dried in the sun on cloth. All of these methods required only knowledge and patience. They required zero money. A family that mastered food preservation could stretch a summer harvest into nutrition for an entire winter. A family that did not face hunger in January. Number 1 on this list was something that nutritionists called outdated for 50 years. Now they call it revolutionary. It was the practice of eating the entire animal, every part. Bones became broth, simmered for days until they released gelatin, minerals, and collagen. The broth was drunk as medicine or used as a base for soups. Organ meat was considered superior to muscle meat because it contained more nutrients. Liver was prized. Kidneys, heart, tongue, all were eaten. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausage, or cooked directly. The fat rendered into lard or tallow. The bones were crushed and fed to animals, or boiled again. The hide had value as leather. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. Before we continue, I need to pull you back for a second. This list is not just historical trivia. These are survival mechanisms. These are the actual methods that kept people alive when systems failed completely. Every single technique on this list works today. Every one of them still functions in the exact same way it did 90 years ago. The complete survival guide I have developed, available right now through the description and pinned in the comments, breaks down the mechanisms behind each of these tricks. It explains not just the what, but the why. It shows you how to implement them without waiting for an emergency. It covers the chemical processes, the nutritional science, the storage principles, the exact conditions where each method thrives or fails. That guide is a paid resource, but it exists because these principles deserve explanation at depth, not in the surface-level format of a video. The shift happened around 1950. Prosperity returned. Refrigerators became common. Grocery stores expanded. Food companies invested in convincing Americans that modern was better. Fresh became suspicious. Preserved became old-fashioned. Whole animals became separated into cuts. Organs were discarded or sent to pet food producers. Bones were thrown away. Broths were replaced with bouillon cubes, then with shelf-stable stocks that cost more and contained more salt and fewer nutrients. The knowledge eroded within a single generation. A child born in 1940 grew up learning these tricks. Their child, born in 1965, learned convenience instead. By 1990, the knowledge was nearly extinct. What survived was scattered. Some knowledge persisted in rural communities, in Appalachia and the Deep South and the Great Plains, where poverty remained. Immigrants from other countries brought their own versions. Fermentation in Eastern European Jewish households, nose-to-tail eating in Latin American families, root cellaring in Scandinavian communities. These were not depression tricks at all. They were ancient tricks, universal tricks. The Depression era just concentrated them in one place at one time, when an entire society had to abandon convenience because convenience disappeared. The real revelation is this: these tricks were never obsolete. We forgot them. We declared them obsolete. We built an entire food system designed to make them seem unnecessary. Restaurants serve bone broth now for $18 a bowl. Fermented vegetables appear at farmers markets for $8 a jar. Organ meat is trendy. Whole animal butchery is an artisanal skill. Everything a Depression family did out of necessity has become a luxury good, marketed to people wealthy enough to afford nostalgia. A family that learns these 25 tricks today does not need a disaster to benefit. They benefit immediately. Their food costs drop. Their health improves. Their independence increases. They stop relying on systems to provide what they can provide themselves. That independence is the secret I promised you at the beginning, not the individual tricks themselves, not the specific methods or the ratios or the timing. The real revelation is this: survival in hard times does not depend on having more. It depends on knowing how to use what you have. Depression families did not starve because food did not exist. Food existed. Crops grew. Animals lived. The difference between survival and collapse was knowledge. One family ate well on next to nothing. Another family across the same county struggled. The gap was not luck. It was what they knew. You live in an age where that knowledge has been deliberately erased, not accidentally, deliberately. Food corporations needed you to forget how to preserve food so you would buy their shelf-stable versions. Pharmaceutical companies needed you to forget about nutritional wisdom so you would buy their supplements. Appliance manufacturers needed you to forget about techniques that required only hands and time so you would buy their machines. The forgetting was profitable, extremely profitable. Learning these 25 tricks is not about nostalgia. It is not about being quaint or trendy. It is about owning your own survival. When you know how to render fat, you are not dependent on buying cooking oil. When you know how to ferment vegetables, you carry probiotics that no pill can replicate. When you know how to stretch meat with oats and bone with broth, your grocery budget becomes something you control rather than something that controls you. When you know how to can, to cure, to salt, to pickle, to dry, to smoke, you have moved from consumer to producer. You have shifted from dependent to capable. The 25 tricks themselves are just tools, but the mindset they represent is everything. These were people who looked at scraps and saw possibility, who examined what they had and asked what it could become, rather than mourning what it was not, who trusted their own skills instead of waiting for someone to sell them a solution. That mindset is not limited to Depression-era survival. It applies to every shortage, every crisis, every unexpected turn. A supply chain disruption becomes manageable if you know how to preserve what you have. A job loss becomes less catastrophic if you can reduce your food costs by half. A health challenge becomes an opportunity to reclaim nutritional literacy rather than a sentence to years of pharmaceutical dependence. Start with one trick this week. Pick one that matches your immediate life. If you cook meat regularly, learn to render the fat. If you buy potatoes, save the peels for broth. If you bake, master the chemistry of wacky cake. Do not try to become a Depression-era housewife overnight. You will not. But you will have learned something your parents forgot. And you will have proven to yourself that you can provide something you thought only stores could. That is where your real power lies. Not in memorizing 25 techniques. In understanding that you are capable of more than consumption. In recognizing that the skills marketed as lost are only lost if you choose to leave them lost. Your great-grandparents did not have more intelligence than you. They did not have special gifts. They had necessity and knowledge and the willingness to work. You have the same capacity. Thank you for staying with me through all 25 of these. If this resonated with you, subscribe so you never miss another survival skill that the world tried to bury. Leave a comment telling me which trick you are going to try first. I read every single one, and I want to know what you choose. Hit that notification bell so you're there when we drop the next one.